All right, Craig, all you.
All right. Let's see if this takes. All right. Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to take my video off because it's distracting. Okay. Yeah, my name's Craig Highfield. I'm the Forest Program Director with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. We are a Bay organization based in Annapolis, but we have offices in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So really our goal is to bring people to the table to work on the land to clean up the water. So we have a variety of ways of doing it. I just happen to be the tree guy doing it. So I lead our forest team. We do a lot of outreach and education to landowners, to the general public about the importance of trees in our landscape. We do a lot of reforestation work. We plant a lot of trees in Harford County, but really all over the Bay watershed. And we promote forest management as a way of keeping forests on the land and keeping them healthy. So today, we're actually going to do a Tree Stewards program, which we've done in Harford County with the Harford Land Trust before. We've done it uh, throughout Maryland. We've actually done it in Delaware for a Delaware Tree Stewards as well. And really, the goal of why we did this is because trees are just so valuable, not only for the water quality that we're looking for, but they're just valuable in general to communities. So hopefully this advances. Okay, so and you may have seen this. So we're focusing on when the tree stewards, we're focusing on urban, suburban trees. So we do a lot of reforestation as an organization, and that's planting in rural areas and creating forests. But equally as important as those forests are our urban trees, the trees around where we live, within your own communities, within our cities, within our parks. And they just provide a variety of benefits from cleaning our water to cleaning the air, just being a place to recreate. They increase property values. They've been shown to reduce stress. They improve biodiversity of insect populations. So they're just highly valuable to have a tree in the landscape. And really, who doesn't like a tree? So the reason why we came up with this program is we have a lot of volunteer tree planting opportunities, and we do that, and a lot of different organizations has those. But what we've noticed is we need a lot of people out there doing this work. We could do it with professionals, but we need community members in to do it. But what we also need are informed, trained community members to lead these within their own community. You might think planting trees is, they're easy. You just throw the roots in the ground, keep the leaves above ground, you're done. But there's a little bit more to it than that. So, kind of our goal with this is to kind of train the leaders to lead within their community to do this. So, we, this is going to work. Sorry, my advance is not working. So, back to I'm going to come out and come back in on this. Hold on. Let me try it from the beginning. Let me share. I'm not advancing at all. All right. Jackie, do you see that?
Yep. And now it's
Perfect. Now we're functioning.
advancing.
Here we go. So the idea is to try to teach you all the proper way, not only to plant a tree, but to take care of the tree to make sure it thrives, to be these big community trees that we have in 100 years, essentially helping you set a legacy for the next 150 years of something that you're doing now. So it does take help. There's probably no tougher place to grow a tree than in an urban suburban area where there's just a lot of interface with humans, traffic, walking, all sorts of stuff. It's a tough place to be a tree, but they're so important in those areas. So what we're going to kind of do, this actually is a 4 webinar series that we're cramming into 2 webinars, and then the field event as well. So there's going to be a lot of information. You're going to be kind of drinking from the fire hose a little bit. You may not need to know all this information to be able to plant a tree, but it's really, I think, valuable for understanding how trees work and really how to take care of them, is by understanding how they grow. So the first thing that we're going to do is, what is a tree? So, tree does have a definition that separates it from grass. There's a difference in what a tree is. It's a long-lived perennial plant. It has woody tissue, unlike an herb, the herbaceous stuff. It has both primary and secondary growth. And we're going to go over all of this stuff, what it means. And it is a compartmentalizing organism. So a tree has all of these things that I think you really do need to understand when tending trees as they grow, where you place them, what type of tree you're using, and how it's going to react to its environment, and then how it's going to grow in the next 100 years. We want to make sure that's the place where it should be. And when I'm talking about trees, I'm talking about shrubs too. A shrub is the same thing. It's just a different pattern of growing. It's the same type of organism. So, parts of a tree, just knowing the nomenclature, everyone knows the roots of a tree underground. You have the trunk, which is the main stem. That's initially what's growing on a tree when you plant it. It's the main stem that's going to grow. And then branching off, the lateral branches from that initial stem are the branches, which branch off into the twigs. And then you have the leaves. The branch, twigs, and the leaves are the crown of the tree. So when you hear someone talk about the crown of the tree, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the trunk or the root. It's that umbrella-like thing that you would run under during a rainstorm to stay dry. So types of trees that we have. So we can break down our trees into two different types. We have angiosperms and gymnosperms. So an angiosperm is what dominates our landscape here in the East Coast. Angiosperm essentially is a flat broadleaf tree. They're generally deciduous, meaning right about now, that if they haven't dropped their leaves, they're about to drop all of their leaves. Okay, they go into a dormancy. And it's just kind of a way they've evolved over thousands and thousands of years. When growing conditions aren't great, they just drop their leaves. They don't lose water that way. They're angiosperms, so they're producing flowers. And what comes out of the flower is their seed, but the seed is produced in a fruit. So that's the classic definition of the angiosperm. It's the flowering tree that produces a fruit. And when I say a fruit, it's not necessarily what you would go to the grocery store and eat fruit. It's a seed is within, grows around the ovary of that flower. So, it could be a nut, would be considered the fruit of that tree, or a berry, like in this black cherry tree. The seed is inside of that. They're your typical broadleaf hardwood trees that you would talk about: oaks, maples, cherries, basswood, all that stuff with these flat leaves. Those are your angiosperms. But we also have gymnosperms, which are an older type of tree. They're generally coniferous, meaning that they have needles or awls that they drop throughout the year. So they're always going to be dropping their leaves, their needles, but they do it throughout the year. So, people call them evergreen trees, softwoods, things like pines, spruces, firs, cedars. And what they do, how they're a little bit different, is they produce a seed within a cone. And it's a naked seed. It's not surrounded by a fruit. So those are the different things. They have slightly different tissues inside, different types of cells. But for the most part, you don't need to worry about. They grow the same just as a regular angiosperm. But how they deal with the winter, they don't go into a dormancy. They can still photosynthesize, throughout the year as long as the weather is favorable. They don't go into dormancy. That's why they have those needles. They don't lose water as quickly as the broadleaf tree. But then there's all those rule breakers that go against the norm, those rebels. Things like bald cypress that we have here in Maryland. They are a gymnosperm. They're producing, cone-like structure, a naked seed, but they annually drop their needles. So right about now, most of our bald cypress have dropped their needles, and they'll grow back again in the spring. American holly, it's another one. It's an angiosperm. It's a broadleaf tree, but they'll hold on to their leaves throughout the year. and they drop them periodically throughout the year. So there's always those rule breakers, but in general, our rules for angiosperms and gymnosperms hold true for most tree species. Okay, so this first part of the tree biology is probably the most dense will be, but I think it's really good information. It's really important to understand how the tree is growing. But just like any organism, trees have hormones, just like animals. We have hormones that trigger how we grow. Hormones in plants work with the environment. Okay, they react to it. There's environmental triggers that produce hormones within the trees that trigger different things to happen. Now, I mean, if you think about it, in the fall, what's the environmental trigger in the fall? Well, it's usually cooler weather, less sunlight, as the days get shorter. Usually it's less rain. Right now, it's really a lot less rain. So less available water. All that triggers the trees to produce certain hormones that cause our leaves to start to change color as the trees pull back the nutrients out of their leaves. They pull in the chlorophyll breakdown. They reveal these beautiful, beautiful colors. Just like in the spring, longer days are going to cause the buds of the trees, hormones to produce in the buds of the tree to break the bud and start its growth. And those are all environmental triggers caused by, how much light we get in the day, temperatures, a variety of things. And so any action within a tree from, when the seeds germinate, when they flower, when the fruit ripens, all is triggered by the environment, but it's caused by hormones within those trees producing those things. Okay. Trees grow, when I talked about primary and secondary growth of what makes a tree, trees have two ways of growing. They elongate, which is called primary growth. And that simply means they are getting taller. Okay. The ends of those branches are growing taller. Okay. It's an elongation of the stems. They also have secondary growth, and that's getting wider. Those stems actually will get wider. So you think about, a big tree with a very, very large trunk. Well, every year that's getting wider if there's enough resources. Okay. There are two different types of growth in the tree, and they happen in two very different areas. So think about primary growth as getting taller, secondary growth of getting wider. All this growth happens only in certain places in the tree. It's within their meristems. Okay, if you think about stem cells in animals, it's the same thing. It's where this growth occurs to produce the new cells, the new leaves, the twigs, the barks, the flowers, the roots. They're these undifferentiated cells within the tree that are producing those growth for that tree. So in primary growth, this only occurs at the end of the buds. So if you just pull down a branch, and we'll kind of get into this, more examples of this, that growth, it only gets taller at the ends of the buds. That's where the growth happens. If you're looking at the stem of the tree, it doesn't get any longer. It's the ends of those twigs, those buds, that's where the growth happens. That's called the apical meristem. And I'll show you some pictures and you'll get the hang of it. But that's really important to know when handling a tree, how it's going to grow, how it's going to elongate, and where that happens. The secondary growth, that happens in the vascular tissues called the cambium. And that's just underneath the bark. And you guys might know this. We'll get into this with tree rings. That's the cambium growth of that tree. That's how it gets wider, adding a certain amount of growth every year. So it's going to get wider in a certain area of that tree. So first, let's look at the primary growth. So look at that twig. This is a tulip poplar twig. The growth only happens where those buds are. Does everyone see the buds of those trees? Okay. They're going to elongate only in those areas because that's where the meristems are. That's where those undifferentiated cells live to make new cells, new growth. Now, if you look at that drawing, the parts of a twig, I want you to focus on the terminal buds up at the top and the girdle scar. Okay. That girdle scar represents where that terminal bud was at the beginning of the growing season. Everything below that girdle scar never elongates anymore. Okay. It only grows from the base of that terminal bud. Okay. So that's the growth of 1 year. Let's say it's dormant. We're getting into spring for the next year. Look at that terminal bud. That's where the growth starts. A new girdle scar will occur there, and it just keeps elongating. Anything below it doesn't get any longer. The growth is occurring right at that area. Now, if you look at those lateral buds, those buds on the side, you can see that tulip poplar where those arrows are. That's where growth is happening as well. And that's how trees start to branch out. If they didn't do that, we would just have long telephone poles of trees with leaves on top. But you have the lateral branches growing from there. Okay, they only occur there. And then, so for example, look at these buds real close. So these are all 3 different species of ash trees. So that growth is only occurring at that bud, that terminal bud, those top buds. Those buds control how that tree grows. So it's called apical dominance, but these top buds will control when those lateral branches will grow. And that's why when you plant a tree, the first thing it's going to do is start to grow upward. A small tree, it's going to grow upward first because it wants to get to that sunlight. It controls when those lateral branches will grow. So that first year, it'll take off growing straight. It'll suppress the lateral branches, the lateral buds from extending for a little bit, and then they start to grow, if that makes sense. And feel free to stop me with any questions. I'm just trying to show you how important those buds are, those growth areas, because when you inadvertently damage those areas, well, that branch has lost its growth. Okay. The lateral buds have to take over. And so your trees, they can be they can grow in funny kind of ways. But also, this is when we get into pruning in the next section, this is how you can actually shape a tree and control how it grows, is by where you prune it. All right, secondary growth. And this is probably the one that you've probably all seen with the rings of the tree. And this is how, as that tree's getting taller, it's putting on more weight. Well, it needs to support itself. So the tree has to get wider as it's starting to get taller to be able to support it. And that's the wood of a tree. It's being added every year. And this happens in the cambium. So they're in these meristems, or these undifferentiated cells that are in the cambium layer, which just is a very thin layer of cells underneath the bark. Okay. So they produce, and we'll go into each one. The cambium on the outside towards the bark produces what is called phloem. And on the inside, it's producing xylem. And we'll go into each one of those, what they actually are, because they're 2 different types of vascular system, but I'll explain what they do. There's also cork cambium. So if you think about in that bark, the tree has to add bark every year as well. And it does it through a cork cambium. We're not going to get into that right now. So here's just another kind of look at it on a vertical look. So you have bark, and then you see that very thin layer of cambium. So every year it's producing phloem on the outside towards the bark and xylem on the inside. Okay, let's talk about xylem and what that is. Essentially, that's the wood of a tree. Okay, it's adding wood every year, but it also has other purposes as well. So every year it's producing a ring, and you may not notice that some trees, they're more visible, like an oak tree, you can see it better. And it's just how it adds its cells, to be honest. The size of the cells that happens that you can see, but every year it's going to put on a certain amount of growth before it goes dormant. What that xylem does, those first few layers, is it transports water from the roots up to the leaves. That's essential. Okay, so if you look really closely at the xylem, the sapwood, and the sapwood is the living part of that wood. It's like little straws, you can see. It's what's taking, water from these roots that are being sucked up through the tree. Just think of it as straws and a lot of wood to take it all the way up to the leaves. Okay, it's moving water in and out of the tree. As you go a little bit further, those trees eventually die. I mean, not those trees, their cells eventually die that are transporting water, and it becomes sort of dead wood. We call it heartwood. And you can see those distinguishing colors of the heartwood. And if you've ever cut a tree down or, split firewood, heartwood is usually really hard and really dense. And what they do is, a tree will store metabolic waste within there because it's just a good storage area. It'll store carbohydrates down in that area as well. So it's very dense in a tree is that heartwood. And often it's, really beautiful parts. So a lot of different colors of all that metabolic waste. So what the heartwood do's main job is essentially support. Because as that tree gets bigger, you need that tree to stay upward. It adds wood for support. But the cool thing about a tree is it's going to add wood where it wants it. It's not uniform of where it wants it. It reacts to its environment of where it can put on wood. It doesn't have to put on wood everywhere. But if you look at this tree on the left, at the base of that tree, well, these are very thin soils. In this tree here, this is an oak tree, a white oak tree, buttressed out because very thin soils, roots aren't that deep. So a tree can add more wood at its base to kind of give you that support on there. If you look at, a lot of branches as well, to support the weight of a branch, a tree will often put more wood underneath the branch as a support mechanism than it will on top. And often you can see that in a branch collar. So it's kind of neat to see that a tree as needed can add more wood where it is. As a tree starts to lean, it's going to build wood on one side compared to the other. Pretty wild stuff. Now the phloem, the little known phloem, doesn't have many roles at all, but probably the most important role it has is it transports food. Okay, so if you think of the xylem on the inside transporting water up the tree to the leaves where they make food, well, the phloem transports that food throughout the tree where it's needed. So that's why they call this the vascular system of the tree. So it's moving things around, water up, and then sugars and stuff down throughout the tree where it's needed. But right now, most of that phloem has transported sugars down to the roots for storage. Okay, so the phloem is transporting that essential nutrients, the sugars for that tree up and down, but it's just on the underside of the bark. And so every year, the cambium layer is producing new layers of phloem. Eventually that just gets, instead of like adding wood, it just gets crushed in part of the bark, becomes kind of part of the bark, this new phloem layers. It doesn't accumulate like the xylem on the inside, but it's essential. And so when you think about it, why these little insects, like let's say the emerald ash borer, why they're so detrimental to a tree when they're just tiny and they're just eating a little bit. Well, what they do is they're eating through the phloem, which is just under the bark. They're eating through the cambium, and then they can even get into the sapwood, into the xylem. But they're essentially strangling the tree. They're cutting the food off from the leaves to the roots when they do this. So this is from an emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer lays its eggs within an ash tree, if you don't know. And then the larval, during the larval stages of the insect, they're just feeding on that phloem and that cambium. And at first a tree can tolerate a little bit of that damage, but essentially they eat so much of it, they can encircle the tree that a tree's no longer able to transport, its food down to its roots. And essentially it's cutting that circulation. And so that's why trees eventually start to die back and then they die off because they're starved through this. So that's really why it's so important on these trees to keep them protected. And the last thing, when I said a tree, what makes a tree is its ability to compartmentalize wounds, essentially. So if you think about us, animals heal injuries. So you cut yourself, eventually, you're getting fresh tissue, you're healed. You can have a scar and everything, but you kind of heal your injury. You have these new cells, you're always reproducing that. Trees can't do that, but what they do is they seal injuries. So animals heal injuries, trees seal them. So, on these two trees there, you can see that the tree on the left there, that was a branch. It probably was pruned. It doesn't always necessarily have to be. Trees are always pruning or losing branches. But what that tree will do will compartmentalize that opening, because that opening is where pathogens, fungus, and stuff can get in to the tree to start rot. What a tree will do, it'll seal it. It'll seal it from the inside through the xylem, and it puts new bark and new growth around that. So, pruning a tree doesn't hurt the tree. Okay. And we'll talk about it when we get into pruning. You can prune a tree pretty well, and a tree can react to it and eventually compartmentalize. You can see the tree on the right, it's having trouble, but this was a very big wound, but it's putting wood over that. Here's kind of a better example of what it looks like to compartmentalize a tree, or compartmentalization looks in a tree. So you can see there was a wound there. Trees will add sap and protective layers through the xylem. They'll block up those cells that are transporting water up and down just to try to slow down the rot. And you can see on the outside towards the top there, it's growing new wood over top of that wound. So it's attempting to seal that wound off from the rest of the tree. Bark. So bark does have a function. It's what you think it is. It moderates temperature, both coolness in the winter and the heat in the summer. It moderates that temperature of the tree. Because if you think about it, where's the cambium layer? It's just under the bark. That's where water's being transported just into that xylem. So it's reducing the water loss of a tree, moderates the temperature inside and out of the tree, protects the tree against injury. So, animals rubbing into it, cars bumping into it, humans bumping into it. It's going to protect that tree. It's kind of like a protective coat. And it allows for gas exchange. And this is pretty evident when you look on the tree on the right, which is the black cherry. All these trees, when they're really young, you'll notice they'll have dots on them. Okay, little corky dots. If you look at an older tree on the young branches, you'll see the corky dots. This is where gas exchange is happening. Okay, oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out as metabolism happens. So this is, throughout the tree, they're going to have that. Even that tree on the left, which is also a black cherry, just an older one, they have these lenticels, which allows for gas exchange, which is pretty wild. Just a little bit of information about bark is all trees, when you plant them in small, they're going to have smooth bark. The bark is being added at the rate the tree is growing. Eventually, the tree starts to outgrow how fast the bark can be added. And that's why you get fissures and furrows throughout our bark, depending on the species. It's because the bark just starts to crack off a little bit. Still protected, still a protective layer solid all around, but the older bark just gets some fissures in it. All right, so just a recap about that secondary growth, because it's very important, is, that cambium's just in the inside, produces xylem on the inside, which is wood, stores carbon, transports water, phloem on the outside, which transports the carbohydrates throughout the tree. Leaves, they probably all know about leaves, why they're green, what they're doing. See, they're making the photosynthate for the carbohydrates for that tree. They're making the food. They're the primary producers, just like any plant's going to do, is they're taking the sun and carbon dioxide and water, and they're making photosynthate that they break down and use for various growth purposes. So they metabolize that food. So they're making it through photosynthesis. They make that food, and then they metabolize it like we do with our food. We metabolize it for growth and defense. Uh, Within those leaves is how water actually gets taken up through the tree. So there's no energy. A tree doesn't have to use any energy when they take water in from the roots. What they're actually doing is they're opening tiny little pores in the underside of the leaves called stomata. And that causes evaporation. So water starts to evaporate out of that tree, which actually sucks in water like a straw. If you think about a straw, it sucks in water from the soil to go up to replace that water that's being lost through um, the evaporation. That's called transpiration. So water's coming in through the tree because those stomatas are opening during the daytime. At night, when there's really no photosynthesis happening, they close and water isn't taken in. So it's kind of wild. They open and close depending on the weather conditions. So those are happening in the leaves, both of our conifers, but also our deciduous trees. All right, the roots. We're getting through it all here. We're getting through all the parts. So this is often a misnomer. The tree on the left, and I don't know if it's folklore or the stories we tell, but everyone has this vision of the tree, of the roots of trees being just vast and deep, deep into the earth. I was told at an early age is if you look at a tree and you look at the branches, that's how deep the roots are in the ground. And that actually couldn't be further from the truth. That's not how a tree roots are going to grow. That's not how they're going to do it. A majority, probably most of the roots in a tree are actually in the top 3 feet of soil. Okay. Now they can put sinker roots down that go a little bit deeper, but trees' roots grow laterally. They don't go down into the earth. Initially, they will in a taproot, but a taproot is just there for stability until the tree puts on lateral roots. And we'll kind of get into why they do that when we talk about soil, why it's needed. So the functions of the roots are mainly to anchor the tree, because this tree is growing up with a large crown. It's got to anchor it into the ground. So they have those large roots, they go laterally, and they anchor the tree so they don't blow over. They store carbohydrates in the winter. So right now, all those carbohydrates are down in the roots. Those deciduous trees are taking them out of their leaves and they're storing it all for the winter. And then in the spring, they have food in order for their buds to break. So when spring happens, they're drawing carbohydrates out of the roots, going up to the buds so they can open. And so if you think about, maple syrup, when you're tapping trees, it's in the spring. It's in those times where those sugars are coming out of the roots, going up to the buds, and then at night they drop right back down to the roots for storage. And they kind of have that cycle with all this extra carbohydrates that we have. So they're important for storage. They absorb water. So this is how a tree gets its water, is through the ground, through its roots. So the roots are adapted to not only anchor, store carbohydrates, but they absorb water, and they absorb a lot of water. If you think about it, how big those trees are in the drought that we've had, they're constantly out there searching for whatever water that we do have. And then conduction is they're actually conducting the water up through the tree. And it's not just water that's coming into it. So if you think about soil nutrients, that's the main reason why trees are taking water in. It's to get the water that they need, but it's also those nutrients from the soil. Okay, they have to use that. Those are the building blocks where they're going to add to that photosynthate to make different compounds for the tree to grow. So they're taking in, groundwater, but it's the nutrients in the soil that they're taking in. So just like anything else, and this gets forgotten a lot in urban forestry, but this is the biggest threat to trees in an urban suburban area is compactions. A lot of people look at the tree and they want to protect the tree, but they're not thinking about the roots. Roots need water, they need air for optimal growth. Compacted soils, it's tough to get air. It's tough to get air, and it's tough to store water down in the soil when the soils are compacted. And that happens a lot in urban suburban trees in our areas, I guess, urban and suburban areas. One thing about trees taking in water is, if it's raining a lot, let's say we're getting a big rainstorm and the water's, hitting the surface, it's going down through groundwater. A tree doesn't use it until really the rain stops. So that period where the water's going through, a tree's not using the water. It actually has to drop down through, and then it's pulling the water out of the different pore space. We'll get into that with soil, but I did want to emphasize a lot of times we overwater our trees. Okay. We get so much water on them. What we want our trees to do is go find water on their own so they don't have to do it. If you take a tree and you plant it in your backyard and you water it every day for a year, you might be thinking it's doing well. Tree will look great. The problem is its roots don't have to grow because the water's there. The roots are going to search for the water. They're pressing laterally to go find that water. Okay, here's just an example of your roots. They're growing like your branches. They grow laterally. And you can see they're connected to the vascular tissue of the tree. So they're connected to both the phloem and the xylem of the tree. You can see that acorn right there. This is a white oak acorn. That's actually a root. This is what's happening to our white oaks right now. So white oaks are notorious for just putting out roots immediately from their acorns. This is called the radical. It's the taproot of that tree. They'll do it still in the tree. You can find acorns that still haven't fallen, but its radical is out. It's looking for that soil to get down into to provide that stability for the tree to grow. Kind of neat. But so those trees are acting just like those branches. They elongate at the end, just like those branches, and they push out, and they're going to be searching for areas to support itself, but also for water. Those root hairs, all these trees have root hairs. This is how the water gets into the trees. It's these tiny little root hairs that are produced is where the water comes in. The big roots are for the storage and stability. The little root hairs are how that water and nutrients get into the tree. And kind of the last thing on roots, and this is just fascinating, is most of our trees have a little fungus buddy that grow on their roots. There's mycorrhizal fungi that are attached to various species. So every species has a certain mycorrhizal fungi in the soil that they have a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so what they do is and we want that, this is the fungus that you want on a tree and help a tree grow better. It actually will grow on the roots, on those root hairs. And what it does is increases the surface area of those root hairs to allow more water to get into the trees, which is great. So more water and nutrients can get into those trees because of this fungus. What the trees give the fungus is sugar, essentially the carbohydrates that it's producing. So they're both make out better. So that's why it's symbiotic to do that, to have those. And so a lot of our soils where we're putting our trees may not have those there's mycorrhizal fungi in them. It might take a while to get there, but sometimes when we're planting trees, they may not have those mycorrhizal fungi yet. There's been efforts to actually inoculate soils with different mycorrhizal fungi just to help trees that we plant to grow better. I know in containerized trees, a lot of times they will inoculate that soil with certain fungus in order to kind of help that symbiotic relationship when they get them out, and the trees will grow better. All right.
All right.
Any
Craig,
questions on the trees? Because now this is a real brief section on soil.
Yes, in fact, we have one in the chat that says, when you say that trees are storing in the roots, where in the roots? In the xylem or in the cambium?
Oh yeah, in the xylem. So in the roots, they're down storing in what would be the xylem of the roots. So the cambium, remember, the cambium's only a thin layer of cells. It doesn't store anything. Its sole job is to make phloem and xylem. That's all it does. And so when you're storing stuff, you're actually storing in the xylem. So in the roots it's storing there. It actually in the stems, so in the xylem of the stems, it can store the carbohydrates there as well.
Great. I think that's the only question we have now, so feel free to go on to soils.
All right, all right. Soil. All right. Didn't know you're getting into soil today, but this is essentially what grows your trees. Is the most important part of tree planting. Is your soils, and really we'll get into it when we talk about tree selection. Is how to match the right tree for the right spot. Especially in like these dry conditions. We do a lot of reforestation and we're lucky that we're looking at the soils before we plant and we're trying to match the right tree for it. And we anticipate droughts. We've seen a lot of droughts the last few years. So planting a tree like oaks that can tolerate more droughts, we make sure we have a mixture of trees in there that are going to tolerate those kind of conditions. Vice versa, depending on an area, trees that in real wet areas, you want to do that as well. But it's all kind of matched to the soil and the soil conditions. So most people don't think about it, but what is soil made of? What is soil? So it's essentially broken up rock. You have different layers of rock. You have the tiny particles that are clay, slightly bigger silt, and you have sand, gravel. Those are your minerals. It's broken down bedrock is what soil is. 45% of your soil is that. 5%, this is a good soil, 5% is organic material. So dead trees, dead vegetation, dead animals, whatever. It's organic material that's breaking down. It's the nutrients, other nutrients, the carbon nutrients that are within your soils. But half of your soil, and a good soil, this would be like a forest soil, is nothing but pore space. Okay, that shocks a lot of people. It shocked me the first time I learned that. Is half of your soil is just space, open space with nothing in it. 25% of that is filled with water, and 25% of that is air. Now, those vary depending on, how close to a rain, where, after a rain, you're going to have a higher percentage underwater. But that's where the trees get their oxygen. That's where they can release carbon dioxide into those spaces, and that's where they bring in their water. So within that pore space, you have macropores and micropores. The macropores, so the big spaces, are usually where the air is. Carbon dioxide, you have gas exchange there. The micropores are where the water is. So believe it or not, even though we have really dry soils, there's still water in our soils within those first 3 feet. There's still water. Trees are using them. Now we're going into dormancy, so they're not transpiring now or as much. They won't be in a little bit. So it's less important. But that pore space is vitally important to your soil because that's how they're getting air or exchanging air, and that's how they're getting waters in that pore space. Okay. And like I said, on your site, you're not going to be able to change your soil type. You could try to engineer stuff, but on most sites, you're kind of stuck with what you have. And so we have various types of soil. So you might have a clay soil, and that's usually hard. It doesn't drain well, kind of mucky. But you could have, in some areas, sandy soil, where it always is really dry. Water goes through it very quickly. You can have a silty soil, which is kind of ideal. It's kind of perfect. But the chances are you just have a combination of different particles. So you might have a clay loam, a loamy sand. So a variety of things of how trees can grow on those kind of conditions. Things like, if you just look at oaks, like a white oak or a red oak might grow well in a sandy thing. But in a clay soil, you might use a pin oak or, willow oak, that type of thing. And we'll get into how to select trees probably tomorrow on how to do it. There's an easy website that'll help you select what trees will do well in those kind of conditions. The tough part with urban and suburban areas are compaction. Like I said, we're in a kind of a built environment. A lot of our soil is just been run over by vehicles, just traffic, even foot traffic. It's compacted those air spaces a lot out of our soil. Usually we have engineered soil or soil that's been manipulated or moved around a lot. We're usually lacking a lot of organic material. A lot of times there's not a lot of leaf litter. If you compare a soil to a forest where leaves are dropping every year and breaking down every year, compare it to a suburban area where, we get the leaves off every autumn, and we take them away and they go somewhere, but they're not breaking down, adding to that organic material that we have. But it's still possible to grow a variety of trees on there. They're just different. So the compaction, like I said, I'll just emphasize again, in our built environment, we're losing that pore space, which is really tough. This is why, real urban trees are short-lived a lot of times that they're planted, because we don't care for the soil around it. And once a soil gets trampled, it's really tough to get that pore space back into it. It's not impossible. We'll talk about that with planting trees, but it is difficult. So it's kind of matching a tree that will do well in compacted soils. All right. That's all I have for tree biology and soil biology. We're going to go into actually site assessment next, but I wanted to pause there. I'm going to take a drink of water and see if there's any more questions.
Nothing in the chat at the moment.
All
If
right.
anyone has anything, feel free to drop it in there. Or if it's really burning, you can unmute yourself for a sec and ask Craig, but I'm not seeing anything.
All right, that's fine. Hey, that's fine. That was the heavy lifting though. That was down in the weeds, out in the forest part. But do I think you need to know all that stuff to plant a tree? No, I don't. But I think it's really important in understanding how a tree grows, understanding how to protect a tree, all that stuff. It's vital. So now we're going to talk about site assessment. So you have your knowledge of trees now. Now we're going to talk about how we assess a site, because you're not just going to take one tree. I'm going to take this tulip poplar, I'm going to plant it right here. Well, there's a lot to think about. First of all, like we said, trees are long-lived. We got to come up with a plan for our trees. What are our goals? What are we trying to do? First thing we do there is a site assessment. We need to figure out the area that we're going to plant. We're going to collect data on that to figure out how to best plant trees, how to select trees, where to put them, how we're going to take care of them. That all starts with a site assessment. Okay. A site assessment essentially is evaluating the conditions on the land. Okay. What's already there? What's going to be our challenges on those sites? So I always go in. All plants need water, nutrients, light, and space in order to thrive. Okay, when you're looking at a site assessment, you're just making observations about what the site looks like. If all of our land in Harford County or state of Maryland, if it all was like a garden, think about a garden. You guys are probably putting your gardens to bed. We manipulate the soils. We have good, nutritious soils, well aerated. We water. If all our land was like that, like we just had the same soils, perfect soil like that, we got good rain, we would have 2 trees growing in the state of Maryland. That would be it, because those would be the ones that thrive on those sites. The tulip poplars, sugar maples, they all beech, they can all grow really well on those kind of sites. But that's kind of the beauty of Maryland. The beauty of our environment, our soils, is we have different soils, we have different growing conditions, and they've just been created by geology. They just erosion, earthquakes, a bunch of stuff. So we have different types of soils. Depending where you go, you have different topographies, which are affecting growing conditions. You have different everything. And so take a look at this mountain, for instance. How do you think the soil on the top of that mountain compares to the soil on the bottom? Where's there more moisture, top or bottom? Well, it's the bottom. Water runs downhill. So you're going to have kind of dry, minerally soils on the top of the mountain, and you're going to have kind of rich, mesic or moist soils at the bottom of that mountain. Well, trees grow differently depending where you put them. So observation is kind of knowing. If I was going to plant a tree on the top of the mountain, I sure would want to make sure it could handle thin soils, dry conditions. The trees on the bottom of that hill, it's going to be very competitive there. So I want to make sure it could outcompete other trees that are growing. That's why when you drive out to the mountains, maybe it was 2 weeks ago that was peak, maybe a week and a half, you just see the various colors of those trees growing on the mountain because it's the trees that do well where they are. They've won that competition, and that's why they're out there. I want you to think about the bald cypress tree, for instance. So bald cypress, and I don't know if everyone's seen them. Well, we're lucky in Maryland. This is as far north as bald cypress go right now, naturally go. So you probably seen bald cypress down in the muck. It's awesome to see a bald cypress swamp. They put up those little knees up there. That's part of their roots to get oxygen down to the roots. They just have really cool adaptations. Now, these bald cypress do not like growing in the muck. They don't prefer to grow in the muck, meaning they would probably go biologically, they grow their best on moist, mesic, silty soils. They'd be the biggest they can be on there. The problem is they can't compete with other trees on those conditions. Okay, they're just not going to grow as fast in those conditions. They won't grow well at all on really, really dry soils. And for instance, this is just my neighborhood. Those are all bald cypress trees right there. They're doing really, really well. They grow really well. But those soils, keep their moisture. They're good soils. They keep their moisture, and those trees are surviving. Beech, for example. Beech, what gives them an advantage why we're seeing a lot of beech reproduction is they tolerate shade, probably better than any other tree in our forests around here. They can grow really, really well in the shade. Tulip poplar couldn't do it. Black cherry couldn't do it. They would wilt away in the shade. But beech grow well in the shade. They don't prefer it. Here's a beech tree growing in the open sunlight. They don't necessarily prefer it. They'll be bigger when they have full sunlight, but they can grow well in the shade. And so it's important to start to learn about some of those attributes of trees, of where you're going to place them. If you had a site with some shady conditions where there's existing trees, well, maybe a beech is a good place to put it. Or if you have an area where it's really wet, and we often have these areas, well, maybe a bald cypress might work down in an area that maintains a lot of moisture that never really dries out because it'll thrive there. It's part of selecting it. So for this class, we do use a textbook. Everything that we're going to be covering kind of is in this book. It is the Urban Watershed Forestry Manual, Volume 3. Now, this is available freely online. You're going to be planting on Saturday with Edward, my colleague Edward. I'll make sure he gets copies of this book. If anyone wants a copy of this manual, it's a great manual. If you prefer to do it that way, you can just take one of those. I give them to Edward, but it has really everything you need to know about planting trees, selecting trees. It's a great resource. We use it kind of as the textbook for this course. So in it, we're going to kind of go through some steps on how to do a site assessment. So you don't have to know it. This is all kind of written out for you, but it'll tell you what you need to look for as you go to your area. Let's say you want to plant a little pocket park, or you're going to plant someone's backyard. This tells you really what you need to look for, just to jot down some information. Okay, so we'll kind of go over those things: general site information, climate, topography, and you may not be able to get information on everything. That's okay. When you're doing a site assessment, you're just fact finding. You're just trying to look out there. For one thing, the first thing I would say is general site information. Well, when we do this, and you might be doing it on public land, first thing you put in your assessment is location. Is address, is it coordinates, whatever, who owns the property, and most importantly, what is the current land use? Okay, you're going to be planting trees. Planting a tree in this open pasture is going to be much different than planting this in an urban park. The conditions are going to be quite different. So what is that current land use that you have? Very easy questions. Second thing you're going to look at is kind of climate. We'll talk about hardiness zone. We're not going to have to worry about it because if you're just planting here in Harford County, you're in the same hardiness zone. But this is important right here, is the sunlight exposure. I want you to think about when you're walking on that site looking where to plant trees, is trying to figure out how much sun that tree is going to get. Because if you put a tree, let's say like a black cherry, in that little park there, a little alleyway there, it's never going to survive because a black cherry needs full sunlight to grow. It does not tolerate shade. Tulip poplars do not tolerate shade. Loblolly pine does not tolerate shade. It needs full sunlight. It'll grow very well, very fast in full sunlight. But if your site doesn't have that, you need to mark it. So within your site, you're going to say, well, maybe this section over here, you can get full sun right here. That'll help you figure out what species to put there. This area might get, 3 to 6. So it's going to be partial filtered part of the day. Maybe there's trees on one side. You might pick some trees that can tolerate some shade, like let's say maples, like red maple, silver maple, oaks. They can tolerate a little bit of shade. And then you might have an area that's very shady. And then, so you want to match it with trees that are going to grow really well in the shade. Like I said, with the American beech, being one. Sugar maple is another one that tolerates good shade. Hemlock is a great one. Basswood. But I'll show you a list. You don't have to know all this. I'll show you a list of all the tolerances and all the trees. It's just kind of matching the right tree for the right place. Think about the climate that you're planting it in. So believe it or not, in urban and suburban areas, there's kind of manufactured climate as well. Think about, next to an asphalt parking lot, or, even on the islands of some of those parking lots, that there's a lot of heat that's trapped in those asphalts. If you look at this little alleyway through there, if you ever walk through a city on a windy day, well, there's a lot of wind that can get channeled or funneled through these certain kind of openings. So making a note of that, just little features out there within your site. A site like this is one of our reforestation sites in St. Mary's County. But if you see how wide open that is, perfect for planting anything that's going to tolerate or needs that big sunlight. But look how open that is and how flat it is. Very vulnerable to wind. Okay. So it would be important to kind of put that in there. There's the hardiness zone. Harford County's, well, I guess it has two slightly different hardiness zones. Hardiness zone is just how many days of below freezing temperature they're going to tolerate. Kind of why that's important. And you don't really, I don't think you really have to worry about it. But, some trees in Maryland we're right at our limit of where they'll grow. Okay. So as our climate heats up, as it starts to change, and we're starting to see warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons, things like loblolly pine, which is, it's native in Maryland. You see it more down in southern Maryland and Eastern Shore. There's its range right there. But as we start to warm up, there's going to be a migration of loblolly going north, essentially. It doesn't tolerate long periods of really, really cold, below freezing temperatures. But as we warm up, you'll start to see loblolly growing successfully more north. And then things like sugar maple. Well, if you look at where we are in the range of the sugar maple, that is Harford County right there. That's like the southernmost range, kind of in the eastern part of sugar maple. So this is one that I wouldn't recommend planting in Harford, because if you're thinking about you want that tree to live for 100 years, well, who knows what's going to happen? It may be just, it won't tolerate those conditions, after 50. It might just be a little bit too warm for sugar maple to make it. Topography, that's a big thing. And we kind of already talked about this area is, uphill compared to downhill. If there is some topography on there, think about it for the trees, drier soil conditions uphill. It's a little bit more moist downhill. But think about that too, especially if you're going to lead a group of volunteers on the topography. Look at it. Is the site just too steep to plant? Come up with a plan on how you're going to plant something in that steepness, or how are you going to take care of it? How are you going to water it? Is it worth it to put trees in there if you can't take care of them? So noticing slopes, soils, it's a tough one. There's methods for doing that. But just to get through is drainage is a big one. And you may not know it just looking at a site. That's why it's kind of often helpful to go out after a rain, kind of see where water's not draining quickly. In this area here, you can see if water sticks around for a while, it tells you a lot about those soils. It tells you about what you could probably plant in that area. Just looking at this, just evidence from that. You could probably notice got a little bit of compaction there. So little things as you're starting to walk your site, just kind of making observations like in this field, well, this is going to be compacted. It's really hard to plant in that compacted area. Maybe you might choose a different area. It looks like this area probably gets a lot of traffic. Maybe occasionally they have cars parked on this park. It'd be really tough to grow a tree. So just little observations you're going to put in there. Existing vegetation. Okay, where you're going to plant a tree, well, what's already there? You know, what could be coming? If you look at that area on the right, I'm embarrassed to say that's one of our plantings that we didn't realize what was already in the seed. So I don't know if anyone's ever dealt with mallow minute, but it's an annual plant, usually comes out later in the spring. We planted this whole site and then came back in the spring to do our first maintenance and was already covered with this mallow minute. We didn't know what was already there, what was already in the seed bank. But you might have sites where there's already existing vegetation. That's your competition. That's your challenge. How are you going to deal with the existing vegetation that's already there, like this multiflora rose that's growing through there? You know, is it going to be an easy open field? The next thing, especially in more of an urban suburban areas, are looking for potential conflicts there. You know, we there's been areas where, you know, we've done this on farms a lot where there's just old, you know, piles of junk that, you know, been buried for years that we've kind of encountered when trying planting the trees. So kind of knowing what conflicts are already there. Where's the pavement? Think about ordinances. How far back do you have to stay from existing pavement or wires or existing buildings? You know, are there any kind of ordinances uh, that you have to pay attention to? Look for damage on trees already. There's nothing more disheartening than planting a tree and then coming back and wildlife has taken full advantage of it. Deer are probably our biggest problem in tree planting. This is going to be your biggest problem when you plant trees. Trees go in suburban areas. They've been in urban areas. They're in rural areas. We have an overabundance of deer in the state of Maryland, really in the mid-Atlantic as well. And, you know, every tree we plant, and you saw maybe our planting that I showed in St. Mary's that it has those tree shelters on them. We can't plant trees unless we put those shelters on them for at least 5 years until they get tall enough to be out of there. To be out of the deer's reach of eating. Because remember, deer, you know, what part of the tree that they're eating is actually the buds. That's where all those nutrients are. Remember we talked about that, the apical meristem, that meristems are all there. All that energy is in the buds, the new growth, the new leaves. So, you know, this time of year and throughout the winter, you know, deer feed on the buds of trees. So a lot of our forests will go in, will be denuded of trees because they can't grow. You see this, they're eating in our suburban landscaping, you know, they'll do that. So the trees that you're going to plant, you have to think about what type of deer protection they are. You can see the picture on the right is the eating of the buds, the end of the buds, but even kind of during the rut, this is caused by bucks that love to rub their antlers to mark the trees with their glands in their antlers, but they also are rubbing off velvet early in the season on those trees as well. A tree can recover from that, but it's going to take a lot of energy to do that. So it's very disheartening. And, you know, beavers, we've had issues with beavers, you know, planting near ponds and things like that. They'll come out and eat things. And like I said, kind of those setbacks. Here's that park again. If you just take a look at it, yeah, you can see that I took a picture of where the traffic does come in here. But things to think about when, you know, planting are like fence lines. Okay, how far away do you need to be from the fence line? If you put a tree near a fence, think about how it's going to grow in 50 years. Is that going to be an obstruction at some point where 10 years later they cut it down because it's interfering with infrastructure? Okay, how far back? How far do you need to be away so you can maintain it? Looking for overhead lines. There are setbacks required, but countless trees have been planted under power lines only 20 years later to have to chop up because of that. Existing roadways. So there definitely is a setback. And when you plant a smaller tree, you may not thinking about how those lateral branches will extend, but you don't want to create a nightmare where you're constantly pruning a tree because it's getting into the right of way of the road. And there's that compaction. So look at that. Yeah, that tree on the left. This happens every year. Power company comes through and they just start hacking our trees that are under their power lines because we need the power to run through. Can't have the branches falling on or the trees falling on our power lines. So unfortunately, you get a nice tree that just gets hacked away because it's too close to the power line. Where maybe that should have been offset before planting, or sometimes you can't help it. The lines went in afterwards. Uh, Look for different infrastructure things here, like drainage. Okay, this is obviously a wet area. You shouldn't even get too close to the pipes when planting trees. Thinking about the roots 10 years later, are they going to interfere with some of the drainage that's happening to this area? Um, there's another book too called Tree Owner's Manual, and it has this listed too. These are just general guidelines when planting. You might notice the sidewalks, and I live here in Annapolis, and some of those old trees, you walk on those sidewalks, and it's like walking on a roller coaster. It's just the roots eventually will heave up the sidewalks. That's what roots do. So, thinking about that, how close you're planning to existing sidewalks. Well, it's not an issue now, but when 20 years, that will be an issue. The trees will lift pavement. Think about, and this is always tough, but think about what's under your soil. So this looks like a great place. This is actually my neighbor's property when I went in, but I was there. I've been in this property a while, and that's what it looked like before they built the house. So, I mean, it looks great on that, but think about that soil now, like how different it could be when, it was this. So it's heavily compacted soil. That's why doing a soil test or just trying to dig a shovel that, see what the compaction levels on it, because it can be deceiving after structures are built, because you just put a little sod on top, a little bit of topsoil, and hopefully it's good. All right, so what I'm going to do is just go through a couple sites here, and then I'm going to point out things to kind of look at when you're approaching it. So this is just a walk through my neighborhood. I took some pictures and the things to think about. So if you look at this property here, let's say you wanted to plant in this property here. Things to definitely consider about is the driveway, is not planting too close to that. But think about where the sun, especially in the summertime, how it's traveling across the sky. Because, depending where you are, that could be, half a day of shade on your trees if you're planting to those trees on the left. Or, depending where east-west is, it could be a full day of sunlight. So think about where the sun, how it comes over in the summertime on those trees to determine, how much sunlight those trees would need, and then what trees you would select to put into that area. So this area here, this big property, things I would consider is very, very, very steep. You always think about kind of safety, making sure you be able to get to those trees. So trees on the top should tolerate, drier conditions. Trees on the bottom, a little bit more moisture. Think about any infrastructure like the sewer line that's there at the bottom, not planting too close to that, not planting too close to existing vegetation. Here's a little pocket park near our house. Definitely some things to consider. One, it's, to the road, you have that road sign. So that is a road sign, making sure you're not planting a little too close to that road sign that in 10 years, your lateral branches are covering out that warning sign to only go 10 miles around that bend. So I'd worry about that. You have that nice cedar tree there on the right is, that's staying green all year. I wouldn't plant too close to that unless you get a shade tolerant one. I see the overhead lines, the power lines there, obviously staying off there. A big thing here is if you look on the right, kind of that little shrubby stuff that goes along the right side of that, I'd be concerned. I'd write this down. That's all bittersweet, actually. It's bittersweet vine. So I would make a note of that. Make a note there's bittersweet vine there, because eventually, if that's not cut back or controlled, eventually that will come into your planting. And if you know anything about bittersweet, or you've had the experience of trying to deal with bittersweet, it'll just go around a tree. It just goes around. It's a woody vine, so it goes around and acts just like a tree. Its stem gets thicker and thicker, but it's twisted around a tree. It can actually girdle trees. I've seen trees killed off by bittersweet vine because it'll wrap itself, keeps growing, and literally just strangles the tree. And this is kind of a last one I'll show you is my observation on that one is this is just a park. I mean, you look at the blacktop there. How's the blacktop used? Where's the water going that's on that blacktop? My guess, it's in this high vegetation area. That's where the water goes. Probably that area is so wet they just don't mow it, and maybe it's just a retention for that. You could still plant in that. That can, you can still maintain if those wet conditions. You're just using wet tolerant trees to go in there. Think about how close you can park or you can plant to that asphalt. You have to stay off a little bit, but there's opportunity there. But those are just some things I would write along on that. All right, that's all I had on that. So that what I was going to cover next time is we'll get into tree selection. So what you've done is you learn about trees there, you learned about site assessment. How do you go out and assess a site? The next thing we'll do is from that information that you made, you're going to select trees that will match those conditions. Okay, I'll take you through that. There's a couple really good resources on how to do that. And then the last section we'll do tomorrow is the crucial part. This is what will make you stewards, is how to properly plant and take care of a tree. So, it's a little bit more difficult. It's not rocket science, but it's a little more difficult than just digging a hole and plopping the tree down in there. So things you have to do to set the tree up for success for the next 100 years that we have. Good. So that was a lot of information, but we can roll through it.
All right. Well, we do have some questions for you, Craig. People were
Mm-hmm.
very interested in what you were talking about, especially in terms of the urban forestry book.
Uh-huh.
Um, so one question that we have, let me see if I'm doing it all the way up. Yep, is does that book include a list of trees and what conditions they prefer? For example, shade versus sun, urban versus maybe
Yes.
more field.
That will give you more information about a tree than you ever want to know. It'll take you through it and what it does, it lists tolerances of that tree. So in this one specifically written for urban type forestry. So I'll be honest, there are some trees in there that are not native, which can be okay in the urban environment, but it'll give you everything from soil conditions that it tolerates and doesn't tolerate to light conditions to salt spray. If you think about, in an urban condition where we're using a lot of salt in the roads, it gives you all kind of information on that. And then I will actually show you tomorrow too a website where you can actually punch in all those conditions that you have, and it'll spit out a list of or of native trees that'll do well in those conditions.
Great. Um, Next question is, are there trees that bioremediate the soil like mushrooms or sunflowers do?
Well, I know they've used like hybrid poplars are one that they use for real like brown sites, real remediation on that. I would guess it would depend on what you're trying to remediate and its tolerances on that. Yeah, I don't have a great answer on that.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good start. Let's see. What is the best way to learn about local ordinances?
Ooh. Yeah. The municipality, either if you're in a municipality or the county, they should have on their website the local ordinances for tree planting.
Yes, and I can, because Craig, like he said, lives in Annapolis, so I'm sure he's a little hesitant to speak on Harford County stuff. But I can tell you with the land trust, if you're a county resident, you would look through planning and zoning. Their website, they have a search where you can find ordinances. And then if you're in any of the three municipalities, I too believe that they have links within their planning departments where you can find that specifically.
But you also, if you are like involved, if you're all part of a homeowners association too, they may
That's a
have
good
their
point.
own ordinance as well. So
Yes, that's a good
check
point
them
as well,
all, and they
Craig.
should be clearly out, but you never know.
Okay. Is brackish water a consideration or is water just water? And when we are trying to develop wildlife habitat, we really want less dense tree canopy so that sunlight gets down to the understory where songbirds typically nest, correct?
Not necessarily. No, we what we need are a variety of those. If you're talking about forest, the forest conditions. So you could have a dense canopy, and certain animals will do, like a lot of birds will nest high up in the tree. But you're right, there are ground nesting birds. Um, to do that, it really depends on the species. But you're right, like a closed canopy is good. So I'm sure certain animals thrive in those kind of conditions. Um, but open the canopy, like an open canopy thing. That's why we kind of promote landowners to do timber harvest, is to kind of change a forest, kind of a structure in a forest to get new regeneration growing. So it really depends. I don't know if that's set, but I'd say a variety of forest landscapes is key for wildlife.
Yes,
But
I
what
would
was the
agree.
brackish water? I didn't understand that one.
Is brackish water a consideration in terms of, wet feet for roots, or is water just
Oh yeah,
water?
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, no. Saltwater, brackish water is yeah, no. Trees don't grow well in brackish water. And that's a huge issue with climate change, is saltwater intrusion within our coastal area. So that will eliminate a lot of our coastal forests. And it's no truer if you guys just jump in the car and head down to old Dorchester County. Just thrive for that, because that's a real condition. It's a really low elevation in Dorchester, and they're losing tracts of forest because of saltwater intrusion. Yeah, when we're talking about wet feet, that's all fresh water, just swampy areas or just low lying riparian areas that might get flooded, that kind of stuff.
Yes. All right. This is a question that may be specific to our tree planting on Saturday, but maybe we can answer it in just a generic Tree Stewards program. The question is, after the trees are planted, who takes care of them and who continues to assess their health?
The ones
So
on Saturday, or the ones on
it's
Saturday, I'm assuming it's going to be the people at the farm that are
Yeah, so
doing.
I was gonna answer that. If the question is about Saturday, the folks at the Friends School of Harford County at their farm, they have folks that are helping it. And then, quite frankly, we could put it back to the Maryland Tree Stewards. We have some
Yeah.
stewards that did this program last year, and planted at that same farm that are still helping and have started to volunteer there. So that's one answer. And, once you finish the webinars with Craig and we do the plantings with Edward, if you were to organize something with your local HOA, your community, you guys will have the tools and the knowledge and we hope the confidence to assess the trees. And if you have questions, Craig is nicely provided all of his contact information on this last screen here at Hartford Land Trust. You can call us up as well. But typically, those that have organized where the planting is going to be, either one property or several, are going to be the ones that probably have the same permissions to continue to take care of it or assess the health of the plantings.
Yeah, and we'll get into this tomorrow, but that's the key for planting trees when you do it is, especially if you're taking the lead and doing this within your community. This is something you plan out, within a planting plan is, you're doing your site stuff, you're picking the trees, but essentially you're making a plan on how they're going to be planted in the ground, and most importantly, how they're going to be maintained. So as a leader, you're kind of working with your group to plan that out, because, for us, we don't plant any trees that we don't have a maintenance plan for. So we know on everything that we're planting, we know we have somebody who's going to be doing the maintenance, and we figure that out ahead of time. So as a tree steward, when you're planting, that's essential, is knowing already how those trees are going to be taken care of, because if not, we're just putting sticks in the ground, because, most of the time, especially when you're doing larger stock trees, if they're not watered in that first year, they're just not going to make it.
Right, especially with a dry spout like we've been having.
Hmm.
That's a really key point. I think we have 2 more questions. Where would one get their soil tested?
Uh, to actually get a real soil test, you can get a kit from University of Maryland, but they actually send it over to University of Delaware.
Mhm.
I don't think Maryland has a soil testing lab anymore. They used to, but I just recently did it. You just take samples from where you are and you can send it away. But that will give you, actual micronutrient content, all of that stuff. That'll give you more than you need to know. If you wanted to test your soil for your own edification, or at least for your own site, like where you're going to plant trees, there's easier ways to do it. And really, what we didn't get into this tonight because it's usually on day 2 that we do this in the 4 session thing is you can actually figure out on your soil if it's a clay soil, if it's a silty soil, and it's a sandy soil. And a lot of that's just very easy stuff to do. And maybe I'll talk about it quickly next time, but just by sticking a screwdriver in the ground to see how hard it is to push a screwdriver, or seeing how quickly water drains through that soil. There's different methods to do it. Or if you do the soil ball test, and you can Google that. It's an easy one that we've done forever. It's just making a ball of soil, you pinching a ribbon, see where it breaks off, and it can tell you, is your soil clay, is it silty? And then the last thing is through like Web Soil Survey, which is just an online mapping tool from USDA that you make a polygon around your property, hit enter, and it'll tell you what soils you have, because all the soils in Maryland have already been tested for at least their content. So very easy way to do that. And we do that a lot for all our reforestation. We take soil maps and just to see what we're planning into. And maybe I'll show you that next time.
Yeah, we use that too at the land trust as well when we're looking at the conservation values of a
Mhm.
property that's wanting to be preserved. We use Web Soil Science all the time. It's a user-friendly website for sure. All right, and then I think the last question that I see for Craig is do you have or know of any resources that are short, easy to read, and outline the importance of trees? I live in a neighborhood where people have been chopping down trees instead of pruning them back, and I'm trying to save them.
Ooh. Yeah, I mean that the one flyer that I had at the beginning of the presentation, just talking about all the benefits of the trees, it was from the Nature Conservancy. That's a really easy infographic to look at. There's a couple other from U.S. Forest Service that will actually, I'll try to find it and send it to you. There's a really good one from U.S. Forest Service. It talks about the value of trees, but it actually matches it with real science. Like it not like it'll talk about the economics of it. Like a study has gone in and showed that people shop more on streets that have more trees, or there's real studies now about how having nature close to hospital helps in the healing process. It reduces stress. I mean, there's real empirical science that goes into a lot of that stuff. So I'll see if there's a simple brochure you can definitely hand out or at least guide people to.
Okay, great. And Craig, I have everyone's email address, so if you pass that on to me, I can pass that on to the folks that are looking for it.
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions for Craig? We're ahead of time, which is great. We have more question time, but if Craig did such an amazing job that you really don't need anything, I'm happy to let you all back to your evenings a little bit early. I'm gonna give my wrap up and give anyone a chance to get their last burning questions in. So as a reminder, our second half of this webinar is tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel, 6 o'clock. I will send out another email tomorrow with the Zoom link to make sure that everybody has it. And as Craig mentioned, he will not be with us on Saturday, but I will. I will send you out just a reminder of what to wear, what to be prepared for, and the waiver again to be ready for Saturday. But it doesn't look like we have any more questions at this time. So I release you. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you back here tomorrow night.
All
Thanks,
right.
Thank you
everybody.
very much. We appreciate it.